just an overview of what we would be doing in this step. Exception handling is called a cross-cutting concern because I want to do exception handling irrespective of the layer. So whether it's business layer, service layer, or even the web layer, you want to do it in everywhere. And such kind of concerns are called cross-cutting concerns. The general rule that I was talking about is do not handle exceptions in controllers or service if you can't add value to them. I mean, there's no reason why you'd want to handle an exception and just throw it. I mean, it's unnecessary code. So try seeing what does the end user see. So think about it and based on it design your exception handling. Exception handling in Spring MVC can be applied at two different levels. One is generally to all controllers. The other one is the controller specific exception handling. So let's start with that right now. So the way we implement exception handling in Spring MVC is quite simple actually. All that you need to do is you need to create a class. I mean, you can call this class anything, but make sure that there's a controller advice on it. So when I say something is at controller advice, it means whatever is in this code in this particular class is applicable to all the controllers. So whenever I say something is at controller advice, it's basically an advice to all the controllers in that particular web application. So in the controller advice, there are a lot of things that you can implement. Init binders, for example. You can write an init binder in here and the binder would apply throughout the application. One of the things that you can also do is implement a exception handling in here. So when I add annotation at exception handler on the method and I'm saying value is equal to exception.class, so that almost covers everything, then whenever an error occurs, this method would be called. So you'd see that when I add an exception controller with at controller advice with at exception handler in here, then you'd see that this would handle all the exceptions. So irrespective of which controller throws the exception, we would always come back to here. We can then log the exception and then we can go ahead and show a error page. So that's basically an overview of what we can do. Also, if I want specific exception handling in any controller, I can go ahead and add this in. So I can say at exception handler value is equal to the specific exception you want to catch in that particular controller, and probably instead of sending it to the return error in that specific thing, you would send it to a return error specific. So let's play around with that very quickly right now. I'll quickly create a class. Now the class is ready. I created it in the package com in 28 minutes exception, and I would want to add in the annotation at controller advice. So a controller advice, basically now this whatever code which we write in here would be applied on top of all the controllers that we have. Right now we have two controllers, right? Login, actually three: logout controller, welcome controller, and the to do controller as well. So let's go ahead and quickly write the exception handling method. So what we want to do is we want to do exception handling. Public string, I mean you can call this method anything. We are going to use an annotation to identify it. So handle exception. You can add a lot of parameters to it, but the important things for me are the request, HTTP servlet request, which is the request, and I would want to get the exception details as well. So exception, typically EX, I guess. So let's start with that, and the first thing I would want to do is to log that particular exception. For now I would use commons logging. So I'm saying logger is equal to log factory.getLog exception controller.class. I'll import the log factory and also I'll import the commons logging log. So now I can go ahead and use the logger dot, this is error. So I'll use this method logger dot error. I can pass in two arguments. One is the throwable. So here is your exception. So I'm passing the second argument exception in. The first one can be any string message that you would want to identify. So some of the times what we would do is we would generate an ID for the exception and we would put that in so that you can use the ID and also show it to the user. That's one way you can have an ID which is shown to the user as well as it's in the log. For now, let's keep it very simple. I would just say request. I'd say request. I'll put the URL in. So request dot get URL through an exception. For now, let's be happy with that. So let's do that. And I would want to send the user back to an error page. So now we don't have an error page really yet configured. So let's go ahead and create an error page. Let's create one in here. Right click, new JSP file, error.jsp. And I would have very similar content as in the other JSP. So all that we would have in here is I'm including the header, navigation, and I am saying application has encountered an error, please contact support on so and so. So that's very good. Now we have all the things that we would be needing to implement an exception handling. We need to throw an exception from somewhere. So what I'll do for now is in the show to do page, I'll throw a runtime exception. As you can see, this is the add to do method. So whenever I click the add to do method, whenever I send a get request to this gets fired up. So I'll comment the existing code in there. I mean, I didn't really want to spoil the whole thing out. So what we did now is three things. One is we created the exception controller. At controller advice, we forgot an important thing. We need to add an annotation on top of it so that this is recognized as exception handler. So I would need to say at exception handler. And what kind of exception does it handle? What kind of exception does it handle? We want it to handle everything. So I'll say exception.class. Now we have, now I think we have a good running thing. Let's go ahead and launch our server up. Tomcat 7 run. Let's go ahead and launch it. I want to first make sure that it's in the log, it's captured. So I see exception handler being detected. So that's very good. I entered the username password, logged in, and I want to manage my to-dos. And to create the exception, I click the add. Okay. So you can see that there's a custom error which is coming in. What you can actually do is you can play around with it. Actually, you could have thrown an exception without having the exception controller in. So you can remove the annotation at controller advice at exception handler and see what would have been the result. You would not have got such a nice page. You would have got a 404 or something of that kind. So that's exception handling. Now, this is how you implement exception handling. This is generic exception handling, right? Now, I would want to add some specific exception handling in the to-do controller itself. How do I do that? All that I need to do is copy this method into the to-do controller, and I would need to say at exception handler value is equal to specific exception dot class. I need the logger as well, so let's go ahead and get it as well. So I'll put the logger in here, and yeah, that looks good. Through an exception, and instead of sending it to the error page, I can send it to error specific page. So I can, let's say there was something specific I want to show to the user when he's having an error on the to do, then I can send him to error specific page. I can do something of this kind, and now I would obviously need to create the error specific page. I want to change the error specific.jsp specific exception page. Now let's go ahead and let's go to home, manage to dos, and now you see that the specific exception page is called. Basically, we looked at two different things. One is we created an exception controller which is generic. So if you don't have specific exception handling for any of the controllers, then this is what is used. And we looked at creating a really specific exception handling for this particular scenario alone. So in the to-do controller alone, I want to have some specific exception handling, then this is the way we do it. Exception handling in Spring MVC is now very generic. So now anywhere in the entire application, let's say it's in the service layer or the data layer or anywhere the exception is thrown, then user is shown the same page again and again. You don't need to do exception handling anywhere in the application. That is one of the fundamental reasons why Spring has become so famous, because now I don't need to do unnecessary exception handling in hundreds of places. I mean, when I look at a method earlier, the try catch used to have like 15-20 lines, and the actual logic of the method was 3 or 4 lines, and it becomes very, very difficult to maintain. I have been in such a big messes a number of times, and I hope you would not have to do anything of that kind. Have your exception handling code as much separate as possible, and then you would not need to worry about exception handling a lot. Keep your exception handling as generic as needed unless there's a specific requirement. The last thing, we will not really demo this, but this is something which would be very useful for you to know, is whenever an exception is thrown in the JSP, our entire exception piece of thing would not work. So when the exceptions in the JSP happen, whatever code which we wrote until now do not get fired. So if you really want to handle such kind of errors as well, then you can add this configuration into your web.xml. So in the web.xml, you can just go into the web.xml and add in error page configuration. Not this. this now is on top of whatever exception handling that we had configured. So we have now advisor, controller advisor, and on top of it there's an error.jsp. If controller advisor does not handle it, then all the errors would be going to the error.jsp page. So that's all you need to know about exception handling with Spring MVC. In the next step, let's look at how to internationalize our application. I'm looking forward to seeing my application in French.